Those are 5 of the most common, I think, pitfalls that pastors fall into that can take them out of ministry and put them on the bench when it comes to their ministry. So what's the solution to this? What's the answer? You see these very public national failures. You know pastors who struggle with these pitfalls. What's the answer? I found an answer in a surprising place. I found an answer to this problem of the lack of pastoral character in the Beatitudes of Jesus in the Sermon on the Mount. I was working back in 2020, the beginning of 2020, my wife and I decided we would memorize the Sermon on the Mount together. And it turned out to be a great year in God's providence to memorize the Sermon on the Mount because COVID happened. And so everything was shut down. We had all this extra time. And so Amy and I, we got into this rhythm where we would just walk our neighborhood for about an hour every day. And we would just work on the Sermon on the Mount together. And we began to memorize this. Well, as I'm memorizing the Sermon on the Mount, something hits me. I see something about the Sermon on the Mount that I never thought of before. And it really coalesced. It intersected with this whole issue of pastoral character that had been in my heart and mind for a few years. When I've thought about the Sermon on the Mount, I've always pictured it as a sermon that Jesus preaches to the thousands. You know, I've always associated the Sermon on the Mount with Jesus on a hillside, and there's 5,000 people, and he's feeding them, and then he does the Sermon on the Mount. And I don't know why that image has come into my mind, but I've kind of always just assumed that that's the way it was. But that's not actually how the sermon happened. The very first verse of Matthew chapter 5 says that when Jesus saw the crowds, he went up on the mountain, and after he sat down, his disciples came to him, and then he began to teach them, saying, and then he goes on, Matthew 5, 6, and 7, he teaches the Sermon on the Mount. So this is actually not a sermon to the crowd, it's a sermon to the core. It's not a sermon to thousands, it's a sermon to 12. When Jesus sees the crowd, he actually pulls back from the crowd. He calls his 12 closest disciples to himself, and then he begins to teach them. Now, that one thought changed everything for how I was thinking about the Sermon on the Mount. Because if you think about it, this is the longest recorded speech of Jesus anywhere in our Bibles, the Sermon on the Mount. And it's directed to 12 men who are going to lead the early church. So if we have anything in the Bible that looks like a sermon to leaders, it's the Sermon on the Mount.